Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Holly Borum. You have joined our book party this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome. This book party is sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is associated with a rare book school at the University of Virginia. The purpose of our book parties is to celebrate the wonderful work of our fellows, and today we are going to be hearing from Senior Fellow Lisa Strakoff. Lisa is Associate Professor of English at Marquette University. She is the author of Continental England, which we are going to be hearing about today. She is the co-editor with Megan L. Cook of John Lydgate's Dance of Death and Related Works, and co-editor with Carissa M. Harris and Sarah Beckley of Rape, Culture, and Female Resistance in Late Medieval Literature. Lisa's work on Chaucer and Anglo-French relations has appeared in a variety of journals, including Studies in the Age of Chaucer, the Yearbook of Langland Studies, the New Literary History, and the Huntington Library Quarterly. Lisa will be interviewed by Zach, who is visiting assistant professor of English at The Ohio State University, where he specializes in medieval poetry and book history. His archival scholarship, including an in-progress book about books, investigates the confluence of material adaptation and metaphorical discourse in the treatment of medieval manuscripts after the Middle Ages. His recent essay on the history of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight manuscript is forthcoming in Huntington Library Quarterly, and his first edition, commentary and translation of a 15th century Neo-Latin oration, co-edited with Caitlin Hines, is due out later this year in Hume Love. For the format today, Zach will lead the discussion or conversation with Lisa. Please do keep yourself muted during this time and feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go along. In about 40 minutes, Zach will wrap up and I'll start posing your questions to Lisa. You are welcome at that point to come off of mute and ask as well. And so then without further ado, I will pass this over to Zach.
Hi, well, I am delighted to be here. So Holly, thank you so much for organizing this. And Lisa, thank you both for inviting me and for your wonderful book. So I'm so excited to ask you some questions about the book, but I know that you have a kind of quick introduction for us and a slideshow. So I'll kind of turn it over to you here.
And I was having some PowerPoint issues and with Zoom today, so Holly is going to be running the slideshow, and I will be saying next slide to indicate when it needs to be, well, advance to the next slide. Thank you all so very much for coming. I'm really thrilled to be sharing my work with you. I spent like 8 years writing this book. It's kind of a beast in a number of ways. So I'm really excited to tell you a little more about it. My book, Continental England, reevaluates late medieval Anglo-French cultural and literary relations. Scholarship on this period of English history and culture has drawn heavy attention to a sense of insular and isolationist English cultural supremacy in this period. The law courts are shifting to using English. A huge bureaucratic English government arises. And next slide, please, Holly. There is a burst of highly influential literature by poets like John Gower, William Langland, and of course, Geoffrey Chaucer. But there is a strange phenomenon that problematizes this narrative. Next slide, please. We are in the middle of the 100 Years' War, a massive conflict between England and France running from 1337 all the way to 1453. From the 1350s on, England was very successful in this conflict and thus has a powerful military presence on the continent. Next slide. From 1420, the English militarily occupied northern France and Paris. They were only pushed out in 1453. And here's the thing. Next slide, please. Though England conquers and occupies, we're still pre-British Empire, and it's the late Middle Ages. England experiences itself to be a culturally inferior place, deeply invested in the extraordinary late medieval superiority of French culture, which is spread all over Europe. So where we'd expect a conquest to be followed by a cultural supersession, Instead, the English used their military supremacy to ferry hundreds of French books, tapestries, and other artworks, like this incredible Bedford Hours, across the Channel back to England. So, how do we understand the relationship between a militarily dominant country that is conquering a culturally dominant country? Where and how might we place our usual binaries of major versus minor, center versus periphery? As it turns out, these questions were also being asked by English and French people in the Middle Ages. And surprisingly, their response was to often look beyond those binaries altogether. These binaries, major, minor, center, periphery, they fundamentally imagine relationships of antagonism. England and France are at war, so shouldn't all cultural relations between them reproduce that bellicose dynamic? That is what we would expect. But that is just not what happened. Next slide, please. The poets of my study did not imagine themselves antagonistically in relation to one another. Instead, they tried to write poetry to repair the broken cultural condition caused by the war between their countries. They did this, I argue, by borrowing, translating, and adapting each other's work. Next slide, please. Now, Rita Copeland's Magisterial Rhetoric, Hermeneutics, and Translation in the Middle Ages from 1991 laid out two important models of medieval translation. The first model, derived from Roman translation theory, emphasizes translation as displacement. The translator rewrites their source, necessarily superseding it. The second model, derived from the translation work of St. Jerome and his successors, views translation by contrast as accretive. Translators bring together their sources and attend to the gaps between them to create the ultimate fullness of meaning in a post-Babel fallen world. Copeland herself goes on to suggest that the Roman translation as displacement model is the primary mode by which secular late medieval authors operated, lending itself well to and mixing with the legacy of Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence paradigm. The Roman translation as displacement model has gone on to dominate discussions of inter-authorial relations, so that we often think in these terms of agon, conflict, and hierarchy. But the translation as displacement theory doesn't easily fit a poet like Charles d'Orléans, for example. Next slide, please. Charles, Duke of Orleans and potential heir to the French throne, was taken as a prisoner of war by the English and spent 25 years in captivity. In this period, he became a celebrated poet. Astonishingly, he worked not just in French, but also in the language of his captors, which he learned while in prison. In fact, Charles produced the longest extant late medieval cycle of English verse and translated and adapted poetry by French and English contemporaries. And if you're not a medievalist, I'm betting you probably don't know that the longest late medieval cycle of English verse was written by a Frenchman imprisoned in England, which aptly illustrates the stakes of my argument. Thinking only in terms of languages, geographic regions, and their attendant hierarchies occludes people like Charles d'Orléans who do not fit naturally within those power relations because they're not participating in them. Next slide. I argue for a third model of translation, which I call reparative translation. Medieval poets performing the third model are attentive to the effects of the Roman translation as displacement model, but they seek to perform the accretive work of the translation associated with St. Jerome. Reparative translation is a secularized version of Hieronymian translation. If accretive translation is seeking to recover the fullness of the biblical word post-Babel, then reparative translation is seeking to restore the fullness of European Francophone culture in a war-torn world. But in order for reparative translation to achieve this, it has to work with a textual feature that can exist and be read beyond language and beyond geography. Otherwise, it wouldn't succeed in its trans-regional project. I argue that the textual feature upon which reparative translation operates, and thus the feature with which it works most closely, is lyric form. Next slide, please. Think of how you instantly know what a Shakespearean sonnet is, right? Because of its form. And if you read a Shakespearean sonnet in French, you might initially think it was something else. But if you looked at the form, you'd see that it was still a Shakespearean sonnet. You might wonder whether a Shakespearean sonnet can be written in French, to which I suggest, why not? Associating the Shakespearean sonnet with Englishness tells us more about the construction of an idea of Shakespeare and his relationship to England than it does about the idea of a sonnet. Looking at form over language allows us to think outside language and nation and the weight of institutional authority that binds them together. So the book offers a series of case studies of French and English poets, next slide please, who are working in a shared lyric tradition of extremely popular poems known as the form fixe or fixed forms that rely on extremely rigid rules of stanzaic length, the presence of certain poetic features, shared refrains, repeated lines, shared opening first lines, etc. As a result, they make the work of form and borrowing form and breaking form and exchanging form that constitutes reparative translation highly visible. Next slide, please. My case studies consider a Chaucer, John Gower, Thomas Hoccleve, John Lydgate, Froissart, Vitry, Lamotte, Petrarch, Laurent de Pierre-Merfait, a host of people. They look at individual standalone form fixe poems, cycles of form fixe poems. Next slide, please. Exchanges and invectives between poets written in form fixe, and specifically for the purposes of this presentation, manuscript compilations of form fixe poetry, about which you will shortly hear a lot more, and longer narrative poems that include form fixe lyrics within their narratives. Each case study builds on itself to reveal a highly self-conscious, articulate, and self-reflective politico-poetic discourse about repairing war-torn Francophone Europe. Thank you. We can stop with the slideshow. Yeah. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Lisa. So we've got about 30 minutes here to ask questions. So I had so many questions. I had so many things that I wanted to talk about here, but I was able to sort of narrow them down to just 5. So we've got, about a half an hour here before we open it up to the Q&A. So I wanted to start, Lisa, again, with your, I don't know if my camera can show. No, it can't because the Zoom blur makes it not work. But your title here, Continental England, seems to introduce a contradiction. When discussing the Middle Ages, scholars, including myself, often distinguish between Europe and England by using the terms continental and insular. Over time, continental has sometimes come to signify culture or class. And although insular comes simply from the Latin for island, it has come to describe ignorance, someone uninterested in ideas or cultures beyond their own experience. In your book, you also describe England as both culturally aspirational and a menacing military juggernaut. So can you talk a little bit about the title of the book and how these contradictions are central to your argument about the development of Englishness in the Middle Ages?
Thank you, and that's a great question. And the title is intended to be very provocative and to sort of make you do a double take. And it was interesting what you're saying about continental sort of having the sense of class and superiority. I think that might actually be derivative of this very moment where England is feeling very deeply a sense of its own a sense of its own insularity and looking constantly towards the continent, precisely, and using its military occupation of France to ferry over tons and tons of manuscripts over to England, precisely because it has a sense that Francophone continental culture is going to bring England into sort of a larger European fold. However, over the course of the development, sort of post-19th century nationalist paradigms, instead, we started focusing as a scholarly field very intensely on insular English productions, English language production, the work of these poets that are writing exclusively in English and thinking that they are themselves turning away from Europe, that in fact there's this triumph ascendancy of English culture happening in this period. And my book is trying to decenter that idea by taking very seriously the fact that England has a military continental presence. It is using that continental presence to bring literature back over. And poets are responding arguing to this very paradox that England is militarily dominant, but culturally inferior. And I'm arguing that they're seeking to find a place for this strange England, this strange continental England within continental Europe. And so what I'm trying to do is really decenter the idea of cultural ascendancy that we associate with a self-isolationist proto-nationalism, and argue that in this period, England's proto-nationalism is coming out of its its sense that it has a foothold on the continent. It's not coming out of the fact that it is an island. It's coming out of the fact that it's an island that has stretched across the channel over to the continent. And if we take seriously that idea, then we have a completely different image of how proto-nationalism works, and a completely different understanding of proto-nationalist of sort of how proto-nationalisms imagine themselves in relation to other countries. That makes sense.
Perfectly, yeah. So I'm going to follow up on one author in particular. So the only of your many authors that you work with here that appears in your subtitle, and that is Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer was and is commonly described as the progenitor of English literature, and Thomas Hockley famously designated the man after his death as Father Chaucer and characterized him as the first finder of our fair language. But French language poet, I learned from your book, Eustache Deschamps, praised Chaucer during his lifetime, describing him as a grand translateur, a great translator, a distinction later repeated by Hockley, John Shirley, John Lydgate, and other English readers. Can you speak to how Deschamps' epithet brings Chaucer into a more global conversation about translation?
Yes, I'm very happy to. This is sort of the paradigmatic example of my book, really. So people have always assumed that this epithet, great translator, by Deschamps has to be dismissive because translation is derivative, translation is not original, but translation is how the Middle Ages writes literature. To think that translation is derivative and dismissive of a poet's work is to place a post-romantic notion of authorship and originality anachronistically onto medieval productions, which are steeped in translation efforts. Translation is how people imagine themselves relating to other authors in this period. And with Deschamps in particular, because Deschamps was very critical of the war and writes a lot of political poetry against England and bemoaning the effects of the 100 Years' War, people have always assumed that his, particularly because he's calling Chaucer translator, which people think is derivative, and because he hates England, then obviously this is a poem of insult. But if you look at it more closely, he's also comparing Chaucer to Seneca, Socrates, Ovid, Aulus Gellius, and Virgil. He's constructing a Chaucer as an inheritor of classical culture, a global classical culture, a global for the Middle Ages, a global culture in the sense of classical antiquity that really subtends the whole Latin West in this period. And we have a parallel poem that's very stylistically similar to this one, where Deschamps talks about himself and names himself as the sixth poet in the exact same line of poets. And this is actually something called a sixth of six moment, where you name six other great poets and five other great poets and place yourself last. It's used by Dante, Boccaccio, Chaucer himself, and Jean de Meaux in the Romance of the Rose. So what I think Deschamps is really doing here is constructing himself and Chaucer as inheritors of this global classical tradition, people practicing interlingual translation and also translatio, right? Translation from classical Latinity. And so when Hockley then calls Chaucer first finder of our language, now that sounds like we're back into that isolationist paradigm where Chaucer is the first person to write in English, and isn't that important? But if you look at the broader context of where that quote comes in the Regiment of Princes, it comes in a discussion of translation. Hockley is talking to an imaginary interlocutor about how he should celebrate Henry V. And he says that he's going to do it by translating a bunch of treatises on governance into a compilation that will celebrate Henry. And as he decides to translate something, he immediately launches into this giant praise of Chaucer, at which point he names him the first finder of our language. And I think we need to take seriously that term finder, which is a translation of Latin inventor, invenire, to find. But it's not that Chaucer is the founder of English. It's that he has found English among all the other available languages as a language of translation. Because at this time, French has been the dominant language of translating Latin texts. And what Chaucer has been doing is translating Latin and French text into English. And now Hakluyt wants to translate Latin and French texts into English. And that is actually what he does in a lot of his poetry. So what I'm trying to do is bring translation back into what people are actually talking about when they talk about Chaucer's use of English. It's not that he's an original right author in English. He's a translator from other languages into English, and that's his legacy. And that's how everyone is constructing him in the 15th century.
Thank you. Yeah, that distinction is really helpful for me. So perhaps the part of your book that will most intrigue this particular audience are your investigations of Anglo-French literature in its book historical contexts, specifically your discussion of a University of Pennsylvania manuscript of French lyric and your chapters on English poets, readers, and compilers of form fixe poetry. Can you tell us a little bit more about these discoveries?
Yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the book historical aspects of this book for the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is not, as you can tell, sort of the central feature of the book, but it is something that a lot of the chapters weave in and out of. So what I argue is that reparative translation is most visible in a genre of poetry called the form fixe, which are written all over Francophone Europe and are highly formally complex and very, very interesting. So what I start by looking at in my first chapter is rhetorical treatises that highly theorize the workings of form and how form is borrowed and adapted by different poets, these treatises, all written in the 15th century, are really thinking through how one writes form fixe and how one can share form fixe features to create poetic communities in different parts of Francophone Europe. And so then I turn to this manuscript, the oldest extant manuscript of form fixe lyric, where I argue that if you look at the way in which the poems are organized from the first to the last folio, they're giving you a retrospective encyclopedic history of form fixe lyric from all different parts of Francophone Europe that together does that same work of theorizing the role of the genre. Interestingly, this manuscript was famous for containing 15 poems marked CH that James Wimsatt, in an argument from the 80s, suggested could be that the CH might stand for Chaucer, and this would be examples of the kind of work that Chaucer would have started his career with, which we cannot prove. But actually, so that's actually how I got interested in the manuscript in the first place. But as I looked more closely at the CH business, I realized that the poems marked CH are actually placed right after a bunch of poems by Michaud, some of which were written for literary contexts only, and some of which are written for musical settings. And that there's an entire contemporary complex discussion in theoretical treatises about whether form fixe are written for music or whether they should be written for private reading and contemplation. The form of the poems marked CH are poems that can only be read for private contemplation or oral performance. They can't be set to music in this period, given the conventions of musical settings. So CH does not stand for Chaucer. It stands for something formal and something that is tied to the history of the way in which form fixe as a genre developed over the course of the 14th century. So basically what I'm trying to do is think about what beyond authorship a compilation of form fixe lyric can do and how it focuses on form. But I also, that approach kind of develops over the course of the book. So in Gower's Trentham manuscript, which Sebastian Sebetsky, who's I believe in the audience, has wonderfully argued that it was written, this collection of poetry by Gower, likely supervised by him and possibly even containing his hand, was written as Henry IV is rising to power and reopening the war with France. And I look at the Traité, which is this, it's a cycle of form fixe poems in French with Latin rubrics. But if you read the Latin rubrics and the French alongside each other, they don't match. The Latin will give you information about the stories told in the French poems that doesn't appear in the French poems, and the French poems will tell you things that don't appear in the Latin rubrics, and sometimes they give you contradicting versions of the same event. And the poems are all grounded in Greco-Roman mythology. So basically what he's showing you is that language doesn't work. Like the Latin gives you one thing and the French gives you another thing, and there is no linguistic equivalence between the two. It's played out as also a game of text and paratext as well, main text and rubric. But I read this as the same move that Deschamps is making. Linguistic equivalence might fail us, languages might fail us, but you know what will make you able to read these poems and make sense of the disjunctures between Latin rubric and French text? Your knowledge of Greco-Roman antiquity, which will help you fill in the gaps. So it's another example of thinking about how a larger undercurrent of knowledge unites us across the different languages we speak, and unites us in terms of unites Francophone Europe together. And so he's demonstrating for us that languages fail us, but form and classical imitatio does in fact produce a unified culture. And then another manuscript that I turn to is Hawcleave's Huntington Holographs, which does something very different, but also plays with the idea of form fixe poems in paratexts. So this is a compilation of English poems that are form fixe poems, although they have not been seen to be. Going back to my little sort of joking thing about Shakespearean sonnets, he writes a series of poems that are in English, but they actually completely follow the rules and innovate within the bounds of formal French poetry. And these poems are in English. He organizes them in a way that foregrounds a bunch of poems that refer to French sources or translate existing French sources. And he has them they're in English, but he has them with French rubrics. And the French rubrics, a lot of them are about Henry V's invasion of France and his subsequent domination of France. They're written in the early 1420s. So here I see another sort of the opposite idea. If Gower is concerned about how war will reignite antagonisms between people who speak different languages, which is, I argue, playing out in his disjuncture of language in the Trentham, here Hawcleve offers us a vision of English poems and French rubrics that construct this imagined new Anglo-French space where Henry has conquered France, and now the English are in France, and now we have access to French texts, more and more French texts, and now we can write this beautiful Anglo-French poetry that also speaks to Hawcleve's own career ambitions, because he was a clerk of the Privy Seal, and the Privy Seal had opened up an entire office, sort of a governmental branch in France at this time. So he's imagining this new Anglo-French future through the interplay between texts and rubrics in his manuscript. That is, again, like with Gower, playing out over the disjuncture between English and French. You have to read both to understand what's going on.
Great, thank you. And that's a great segue to my next question. So one thread that runs through the book is how poetry and community can repair some of the damages caused by war and wartime. And the enduring cultural impact on especially non-combatants. You discuss in your acknowledgments and in conversations about your work the importance of your own story as a Soviet-born bilingual speaker of Russian and English and a former asylum seeker turned US citizen. Could you speak a little bit to how your personal experiences have informed your research on translation and nationalism and what it means to be at home in a place or as a speaker of a language?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful question, and I'm really grateful to you for asking it, because the book really does consciously or unconsciously come out of my own experiences. It was very important. So let me rephrase that. Yeah, I wrote a book about how people whose countries are ravaged by war and political conflict, create new communities out of that conflict. I came here in 1989 as technically an asylum seeker. I was stateless for 10 years. I left the Soviet Union, at which point we had to give up our citizenship in order to leave. We were in Vienna for a while, and then we were in Italy for a while, about all told, almost 6 months before we came to the US. And I didn't become a naturalized US citizen until I was 15, and I came here when I was 5. So I was stateless for 10 years. And I do not have citizenship in modern Russia because it was difficult to reinstate because I didn't come from Russia. I came from the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union ended, and now there's a new country, Russia, and you have to go through like this complicated process of reinstating your citizenship if you're not, if you were born before the formation of the modern state. And so what this kind of produced in me, especially these formative years, like being 5 to 15 and not sort of knowing that I was legally stateless, really got me thinking about how artificial and constructed the idea of the nation is, the idea of citizenship is, how we actually structure our belonging. My parents were very invested in the Soviet Union, which was gone forever. I grew up with a lot of Soviet nostalgia, a lot of Soviet films, a lot of Soviet literature, a lot of Soviet values, etc. And they kind of built a little Russian world in a new space in America. And I guess that had always struck me as such an important thing that people do, that when people's old homes go away and fall apart, or they have to leave them, and they vanish altogether from the face of the earth, as the Soviet Union did, except to leave behind a very strange legacy, then how do we rebuild those worlds, and how do we rebuild those communities, and how do we maintain them? And so I got really interested in imagining, well, what would those structures of belonging look like in the Middle Ages itself? And how would people in the Middle Ages, operating from very different paradigms and operating in a pre-nation state, in a sort of before our modern advent of post-19th century nationalism, it's an even more interesting question of how people rebuild broken and torn political communities through cultural communities when the word nation is still kind of just coming into being and still has a whole host of other meanings in the late Middle Ages.
Thank you so much for that. So a final question. One of my very favorite parts of Continental England, and a current picked up by several reviewers of the book, is how reparative translation, your term here, imagines a non-hierarchical, non-agonistic model for human engagement. In a recent issue of Review of English Studies, one reader writes in conclusion, quote, "What is most likely to provoke debate is the strongly optimistic reading of the potential of late medieval literature to transcend political division. Where other readers of cross-channel literature have seen involuted ambivalence, Strauhoff sees openness and internationalist solidarity." That's the end of the quote. Before we turn to the Q&A period, I hope you would speak for a moment about the ethical component of your argument, and in particular, how it could be said to resist some of the traditional male-dominated approaches to the field of Chaucer studies.
Thank you so much for that question. And yes, I was very thrilled to see that reviewers of the book were picking up on something that really kind of first invisibly and then increasingly consciously emerged as an ethical imperative of the book, and dare I say perhaps even a feminist imperative, because sort of the kinds of scholarship I was reading, a lot of scholarship, especially on 15th century post-Chaucerian poets and their relationship to Chaucer, is really invested in questions of patrilineal structural relationships, father-son conflicts. I mean, yes, Huckley does call him his father. Usurpation, owing to the complex relationship between Henry IV and Henry V and Richard II in this period, there is a lot going on with usurpation, conflict, and fatherhood. There's a lot of articles on like edible relationships, sort of these yes, with edible ideas going on between these relationships, and just competition, one-upmanship. Everyone's always constantly competing with each other in a lot of the scholarship that I was reading, and it's not incorrect. That certainly is there. But when it's the sole mode of how authors relate to one another, I think it creates a kind of a skewed sense that every author imagines himself in isolation. Every author imagines himself as an island, the way England is an island, when I just don't think that's the case. I think that if you attend seriously to translation and how borrowing and adaptation works, you get a much richer sense of who takes what from whom, not to knock them down, but to raise themselves up. And really, this comes out of so when I first started working on Formfeek's lyric, which I sort of identified very early on as a very key vehicle for this kind of community building, there was very little, there remains very little literary analytical scholarship written on Formfeek's. It's mostly read by musicologists. And musicologists totally do not work within the idea of language and nation. Musicologists follow the music, and the music takes you everywhere. You realize when you look at how medieval music works that it's centered around specific ducal courts, royal courts, and papal courts like Avignon within Francophone Europe. It does not fit these traditional lines of either language or nation or authors, because there's so much anonymous poetry floating around that everybody's borrowing and using and sort of reworking together. So basically, I realized that if you only think about relationships between poets and authors as displacement and antagonism, then that suggests that there's no way out of crisis except to deepen the lines of the crisis. And I was actually expecting that paradigm myself, working on poets who are, working in the 100 Years' War. You expect them to reproduce those lines of antagonism, but they just didn't. Like the questions that I came to, the hypothesis that I came to my research to just did not bear itself out. And they imagined positivity and efflorescence out of crisis, which I think is a very valuable lesson for our own fragmented times. And I kind of came out of this project truly believing that humans are capable of collaboration and unity and harmony in their exchanges, and that there is more between poetic relations than trying to be the best poet, because you can only be a poet in relation to other poets. You're always coming out of a group and you're always speaking to another group. So sort of I think it just gives us a more interesting sense of how poetry works, and it allows us to once we take away the hierarchy of one-upmanship, we also can find ourselves able to do away with the hierarchy of languages and the hierarchy of different nations and their relationships to one another. It sort of just like decenters everything and allows us to operate in a completely different space.
All right. Well, I just want to say what a pleasure it was to read this book. It contributes to so many ongoing conversations, so many important conversations in my field of sort of Chaucer studies, manuscript studies, but also other adjacent fields. And I really learned so much from reading it. Your writing is beautiful. I want to say such little things like you love to start paragraphs with conjunctions, which I thought creates such like a fluid, like the writing is just so good. You just want to keep reading it. You don't usually call academic books page turners, but this is one of those books that, I kept wanting to turn back to. So thank you so much for inviting me to ask you some of my questions here. And I think we are right on time to turn it over to Holly for the Q&A. So thank you so much, Lisa.
And thank you so much, Zach. That was just like a beautiful series of questions that were so thoughtful and engaged with so many different points of the book. So I really, really, really appreciate this. I invited you for a reason. I knew that this would just be a wonderful dialogue.
Well, thank you both. Wonderful interviewer, wonderful author. And I'm going to open this up to questions from our audience now. So you're welcome to come off of mute and just pose a question. If you prefer to put it in the chat because you have a noisy background or something else, feel free to do that too. So how about questions? Oh, I see Elizabeth Yale has her hand up. Please, Elizabeth, go ahead. First question.
Hi, Lisa. Let me just move this so I'm actually looking at you instead. So I just love this idea of reparative translation, and I love how you speak about it and think about the ethical implications. And I apologize if this came up in your talk already because I had to run out for a second for a student meeting, but it makes me think a lot of Christine DePizan's emphasis on peacemaking in her work from your time period. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about how she relates to translation, or if she participates and sort of figures in the stories that you tell about this period.
So I'm going to confess and say that I know that this book perhaps seems like it should involve Christine DePizan, who's obviously a very key writer of form fixe lyric in this period, but she is, I kind of knew that if I approached her and brought her into it, that like that would be the whole book, like she would dominate everything. So she's kind of like this giant can of worms. But yes, she is absolutely an example of somebody who is ironically in an ongoing, very publicized debate between poets, the famous querelle, the quarrel of the Romance of the Rose, and the way she really does set a sort of a proto-feminist imperative against her male interlocutors, where actually, so Phil Knox has written about this recently, where one of the things she argues for is that poetry, so the debate of the querelle is, for those who don't know, is about how anti-feminist Jean Demand's Romance of the Rose is, and whether and whether or not he's serious about it. And the male interlocutors are all that she's talking to, proto-humanists, Gontier Cole and Jean Gerson, etc. They're all arguing that well, it's just about reading him correctly. Like he's not like he's anti-feminist here, but he's not necessarily anti-feminist here, and it's all about just reading him. And she has this really great response where she says, well, regardless of his intention, his work says bad things about women and is therefore harmful to female readers. And if you can't imagine, she says, a courtly sphere of only male readers. The courtly reading sphere that we live in has male and female readers. So if this work is damaging to half of its audience, it should be stricken from our canon, and we shouldn't read it. So basically, where the men are saying, A, get over it, B, this is his true intention, kind of reproducing this idea of like, but this is what the author meant. She's like, I don't care what the author meant. The reception is damaging, and our community is inclusive of men and women, and therefore, this work sucks, and we shouldn't read it. And so, I mean, there's like a lot more to say about with regard to Christine DePizan, but I think I need to write an article about her someday, because I think that now that I've sort of developed this idea of reparative translation, it is time for me to turn to Christine DePizan and see like how I suspect she is actually running with it. And I just haven't done that yet. So thank you for a really great question. And my sort of short answer is I haven't looked at her fully yet from this lens, but I need to.
I would love to read that article or book, should you write it. So I hope that it becomes a project.
Okay. Julie, see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful talk and already wonderful questions. I can't wait to cite this in my own work. And you mentioned the artificiality of statehood, and I was deeply interested in this concept because I look at the artificiality of like the person as a subject of the state. And I was curious about whether you saw this working in the literature, either to destabilize notions of a clearly defined subject of the state, especially those Anglo-French poems, which I'm super excited to read about. Oh, and here's my cat to say hi.
Hi, kitty. Yeah, that is such a great question. And that does come up. It's actually kind of where a lot of this project originated from, is this fascinating exchange between two poets, Philippe de Vitry and Jean de la Motte. Philippe de Vitry is a bishop, and he also works for the French court very closely. He is a subject, a sovereign subject of the French state. He writes this fascinating invective ballade in form fixe to a guy named Jean de la Motte, whom he accuses of being a terrible poet because he invents figures from classical antiquity. And he's just like, this is disgusting. You can't write this. And he's mad at, and so he phrases, that's his aesthetic problem with Jean de la Motte's poetry. But then he phrases this with all of these political accusations of Jean de la Motte's treachery, because guess what? Jean de la Motte lives in England. And the two things get mapped onto each other. You are a subject of the sovereign nation of England. You're living in England, being English, and your poetry is awful because you are in England and being English, and you're a bad Frenchman, is basically the upshot of it. And Jean de la Motte has a fascinating response where he says, I'm not from your nation. And he's right, because he isn't from his nation, because so we think of nation in this period as still having a very amorphous idea. It's not the political vision of the nation that we think about, but it is for Jean de la Motte, because Jean de la Motte is from Hainaut, which is under the Holy Roman Empire at this point, and he lives in England. And he says, I'm not from your nation. I'm not from any nation, he says, and I write poetry that can be read anywhere in the world. So he's a poet, and he writes the poetry in a bunch of very sort of ironic and funny invented classical allusions, kind of like really running with the he's like, oh, you think I write bad classical poetry? Well, here is a great example to you where I've made up every single possible figure from Greco-Roman antiquity. I'm going to lean into your accusation, and I'm going to tell you that I'm not French. And he's right. And what that conversation really exposes is this fascinating sort of sense of who belongs where. Like for Vitry, who lives in France and is the subject of the French crown, this, like, you have to also be like a very good poet and follow all of these very strict rules of what classicizing poetry looks like. Jean de la Motte is like, I'm not French. I'm just a French speaker. I live in England. I do whatever I want because anybody should do whatever they want. And then what's most interesting is that you get a third interlocutor who joins the conversation named Jean Campion, who is on Philippe de Vitry's side, but he is from the same place, or he's from around Hainaut, just like Jean de la Motte. And his poetry is like tortuously classical, where he's weaving quotations in Latin from Ovid into his French poetry. And Jean Campion really then shows you how artificial all of this is, because Jean Campion is from Jean de la Motte's same geographic region, but he's leaning into the hardline conservative position of Philippe de Vitry still more, showing you like that basically everybody's arguing about what it means to be French in this period, and whether Frenchness means that you are a subject of the Valois crown or not, and how that pertains to the kind of poetry that you should be writing. So it's kind of both. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's also an artificial invention of the subject of the state as well. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That gives me so many wonderful things to think about.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I see a question from SC.
Hi, Cappy.
Hi, Lisa. How you doing? Thank you for this lovely talk. A couple things. So first of all, your response to Julie's question is very interesting and made me think also of ChatGPT and the references that it just makes up in response to research questions.
Oh, yeah.
But so I want to come back to this question of gender, because the list that you showed us, if I remember correctly, was pretty much exclusively male.
Mm-hmm. But it is, yeah.
Drawing from big names and smaller names. And so I wonder if they're like what we might see, and you might not have gotten to this or thought about this at all yet, but looking at like Marie de Clèves in addition to Christine DePizan, and looking at anonymous fixed form poetry. I'm thinking of two poems in Louise de la Tour's copy of Les Trois Fils de Roi that we just, they're anonymous, but they're in a manuscript that was very clearly owned by a woman. And so what possibilities are there if we look at smaller names and non-names and gender with the fixed form poetry and the idea of reparative translation?
Oh, that's such a great question that I confess I was not thinking about when I wrote this book. But it's a really interesting question because it does make me think. This is a half-baked answer and the only one I have at the moment, because I now have a lot more to think about. You guys are all giving me ideas for future projects here. One of the things that's very interesting is the way in which some of the most interesting discussions about what Form Fix Lyric does play. So a lot of Form Fix Lyric are abandoned women's complaints.
Mhm.
And you see some really interesting work with that. And it's unclear if the speaker is female. It's unclear if they're written by male or female authors. I haven't thought about manuscripts owned by female owners. That is a really interesting angle to think about it. But one thing I'm thinking about is one of the works that sort of haunts the entire project is Chaucer's Complaint of Venus, where one of the things that he does is he translates a cycle of Automne de Chansons poetry, condensing a five ballad cycle into a 3 ballad cycle. But he also changes the speaker from male to female. And it's a really interesting moment because he completely transforms like the very genre of the work, because abandoned women or sort of lovelorn women's complaints are their own sort of thematic subgenre of Form Fix. But he maintains the rhyme scheme formally, which is, and it's a very unusual rhyme scheme for him to work with. It's the only rhyme scheme that of that type in all of his short form poetry, and he's kind of paying homage to Automne de Chansons by reusing his rhyme scheme, but he's also changing the speaker from male to female, which completely transforms how the work functions. And then later on, John Shirley is going to organize Chaucer's poetry in one of his manuscripts in such a way that the Complaint of Venus follows on the Complaint of Mars, and that's actually why we call it the Complaint of Venus. It's actually just an abandoned woman's complaint that doesn't mention Venus anywhere in its content, but John Shirley has artificially placed it after this Greco-Roman poem, The Complaint of Mars, where Mars is lamenting, his tryst with Venus not working out and his love for Venus, who's married to Vulcan, etc. So this is a convoluted way of saying that certainly one of the things that's going on is that John Shirley is trying to take this extremely French poem by Chaucer and kind of graft it onto Chaucer's Greco-Roman poetry in a really interesting way that I think speaks to some of the larger things happening with classical imitatio and translation in this period. And another key moment where he specifically overtly talks about Chaucer as a translator from French to English is when he also inserts Annalita's complaint from Annalita and Arcite. And he says that this is a poem that Chaucer has translated into English, but there's no known French source of Annalita's complaint, but it does look like a French poem. So basically, a lot of the ways in which Shirley is constructing Chaucer as an Anglo-French poet is by drawing attention to poems written by Chaucer that are voiced by women. And that's about as far as I've gotten. But I think that that's something really interesting going on and definitely worth investigating, why gender is the pin on which this discussion of Anglo-French seems to be turning again and again. I suspect it has to actually do with audience, because we do have a lot of female book owners reading French poetry, romance, abandoned women's complaints, etc., the most in this period. So I guess if you want to construct Chaucer as an Anglo-French person, then you have to also construct him as a writer of women, because it is women who are reading Anglo-French poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I know that they're participating in some of the poetic games happening at the French-speaking court.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely some interesting.
Ooh, also very important, the French poetic games. There's at least one more article in here.
Thank you.
We have a comment in the chat, which I'll just read for you too here, Lisa. Your model of reparative translation puts you in good company. This is from Anne Coldiron. She says she likes it a lot. Paul Ricoeur, for one, sees translation in similar ways as hospitality to strangers and welcome, as do many writing today on the ethics of translation. And she notes that anxiety of influence never worked well for pre-18th century literature either. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. This exposes my ignorance of Paul Ricoeur, whom I clearly now have to read. But that is really interesting. Hospitality to strangers and a welcome. That's definitely something to think about for the future as well. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that there is great an enormous, I hope that there is great potential in thinking more seriously about the work of translation in the Middle Ages. I know that like everyone in this audience does, right? So I'm sort of preaching to the choir at this point, but I still think that there is a fair amount of scholarship in our field that is really unfairly focused and unfairly centering a sort of a monolingual model of English literature in particular that just doesn't offer us quite enough to work with. And so I like this idea of hospitality to strangers, bringing people into a larger fold. That's very, very interesting. I was kind of just thinking about people already. I was imagining reparative translation as people who already feel themselves to be in a francophone fold, kind of constructed it around them. But this idea of also trying to bring in new voices and new people would be something really interesting to consider further. So that's a really, really great thing leaves me with a lot to think about.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lisa and Zach, and to our audience. It's really been a pleasure having everybody here today. And so I think we will wrap that up, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you guys so much. It's been absolutely wonderful and so much to think about.